Everything is of a mental nature. Matter is always, in every case, and without a single exception, matter is always as it appears in the mind. Concrete materiality is just a state of mind. Let me ask you a question. What if the greatest illusion of your life was believing that this world exists exactly as you see it? And what if it was actually much more flexible than you imagine? Because that's exactly what some of the brightest scientists, philosophers, and mystics in history have begun to suggest. And today I want to show you why, so pay close attention to what this man says. The world, as it is in itself, is mental. The physical is the aspect that this mental world takes on before us, when we observe it, when we represent it in our minds. And then we get the material universe. And the thing is, only the mind exists. What we call matter is a mental impression. For example, if I hold this glass and feel its solidity and weight, these are just mental qualities. Solidity and weight are qualities in my conscious states. And what we call matter is simply a specific kind of mental state, which are perceptual states, the things we see, hear, touch, smell, and taste. He is Dr. Bernardo Kastrup, a scientist who worked at CERN, which is the Large Hadron Collider, famous because it has been involved in a lot of theories that leave you amazed. And today Kastrup explains to us how this reality works. And if what he says is true, then everything you see, from your thoughts, your family, your bicycle, even your own sense of being, could be more different than you think. Because normally, we as humans divide reality into two parts: the things outside, the external, and the inner world. For example, an apple is out there hanging from a tree, and the feeling of hunger arises inside. And that's the basis of materialism, the belief that reality is made of matter and that the mind is just something that arises from it, in the same way a light bulb produces light. But Kastrup suggests that maybe we've been asking the question the wrong way around. According to his theory known as Analytic Idealism, consciousness is not a product of the system, the brain or matter, but rather it is the foundation of all experience. For him, consciousness is the basis of reality, and matter is an experience that appears within it. Sounds very familiar, doesn't it? It's very similar to what was proposed by ancient Hermetic philosophy and to what the mystic from Barbados, Neville Goddard, taught. The variety of matter represents the appearance of the variety of mental states and mental dynamics. Therefore, the brain is what your inner mental life looks like from the outside. The inanimate universe is what the inner mental life of the mind in general looks like. Matter is always the expression of mental states. In a 2017 article published in an academic journal, Kastrup and his colleagues put forward something very controversial but well-reasoned, where they explain that consciousness is not something that brains produce, and it is the only thing that cannot be reduced to anything else. Everything we call reality, from physical things to logical patterns and emotions, is a modulation of consciousness, not something separate from it, and you can see it in your daily life. When you hold a cup of coffee in your hands, you never directly experience the atoms that make it up. You experience its warmth, its weight, and those are sensations that are processed within consciousness. When you look at the sky, you're not seeing blue as a property of the atmosphere. You're having a visual experience of blue inside your mind. When you listen to a song, you don't experience air vibrations. You experience a melody. At no point do you interact directly with the outside world. According to Kastrup, you have only known it through experience, and experience is mental. And this is where Kastrup's proposal begins to connect with researchers like Isaac Bentov and Jacobo Greenberg, to name two great mystical scientists. Bentov proposed that our senses capture only a small fraction of reality and that the brain constructs conscious experience from that limited information. And Jacobo Greenberg, for his part, reached a similar conclusion by a different route. In his synergic theory, he proposed that what we call reality arises from the interaction between our mind and a fundamental field of information called the lattice. In other words, neither of them thought that we perceive the world as it truly is. So behind this very concrete materiality, we know that at least in the case of the nervous system of human beings, behind that concrete materiality, at its core, there are simply mental states. Your sorrows, your desires, your regrets, your feeling of hunger. The red color of a strawberry, the sweetness of the strawberry when you eat it, and all of that appears to others in the form of very concrete matter. So, you look around and think you're seeing reality, but the light bounces off objects, enters your eyes, and that's why you can see the world. It's a process, but that's not what happens. What you see is not reality itself, but a representation your brain constructs. And to explain it, Kastrup uses a very interesting analogy, which is the instrument panel in an airplane. Are you in an airplane? The airplane has sensors. They take measurements of the sky, of the clouds, of what's outside, and those measurements are presented to the pilot as needle indications on a panel. And if the airplane wasn't flying through the sky, there wouldn't be any readings on the panel. But the sky is still there, right? Under analytic idealism, matter is a representation on the panel. When there are no planes flying around, in other words, when there are no living beings looking around, there is no matter, because matter is a representation on the panel. You need a panel to have a representation on the panel. But what is represented, the sky, the clouds, that's always there. Whether you're flying in a plane or not, whether there's a panel or not. So Kastrup says that matter works like the instrument panel of an airplane. If you notice, when a pilot is flying, he doesn't need to see the internal workings of the plane. It's enough just to look at the panel. The indicators show him the necessary information to take off, to navigate, and to land. But the panel is not the plane, it's just a useful representation of what's happening. Kastrup says that the same thing happens with matter. What we perceive is not reality itself, but an interface that our consciousness uses to interact with it. Just like the apps on a cell phone screen are useful, they're the user interface, but they don't show what's really happening inside the phone. So this makes you wonder if what we call the world is just an interface of consciousness. What happens when there is no consciousness to experience it? Listen to what Kastrup says about this, it's really interesting. All the matter in your body and outside of it is the external appearance of mental states. There is an inanimate world out there made of matter, so under the hypothesis that matter is always the external appearance of mental states, the inanimate universe must also be the external appearance of mental states. Those mental states that correspond to the inanimate universe are what we call the mind in general. The brain is simply the aspect that mental activity takes when it is observed from the outside. So you don't even get to say, then mental activity creates the brain. Well, in a certain sense, yes, but it's not deliberate, it's not an act of creation. It's something spontaneous. The brain is the aspect that mental processes have. It's their appearance. It's like asking, does combustion create the flames? Well, the flames are the aspect that combustion has. And this is where Kastrup's idea becomes even more interesting, and you're going to like it, because according to him, you are not a small consciousness moving inside a gigantic universe. Actually, it's the other way around. You are an individual expression of a much greater consciousness. Kastrup argues that there aren't millions of completely separate consciousnesses, but rather there is a single fundamental consciousness that is experienced from different points of view. Think, for example, of the ocean. Each wave seems to have its own shape, its own movement, and even its own path, but no wave is truly separate from the ocean. They are all expressions of the same sea. According to Kastrup, something similar happens with us. You, me, animals, and all conscious beings seem to be separate, but deep down, we would be different expressions of the same consciousness. Now, how can a single consciousness experience itself as many? To explain this, Kastrup recalls a phenomenon that is well known in psychiatry, which is dissociation. In some cases, a single mind can manifest different identities, each with its own memories, emotions, beliefs, and behaviors. Although all of them continue to exist within the same mind, and Kastrup suggests that something similar could be happening at a universal level. What you call I would be a center of experience within that universal consciousness, and what I call I would be another. We feel separated because there are boundaries that prevent us from directly experiencing what happens in another person's consciousness. But deep down, we wouldn't be many consciousnesses trying to connect with each other. We would be a single consciousness experiencing itself from billions of different perspectives. And this is where these ideas start to get very close to what Neville Goddard taught when he said that God is not a being separate from us, but the consciousness that becomes individualized in each human being. Appearances arise when there is a boundary between the observer and the observed. If they are not different, there are no appearances, because appearances are the way something looks from the outside. For there to be an outside, there has to be a division, a boundary between the inside and the outside. So the observer looks from the outside and what is being observed exists on the inside, right? So, how do appearances arise when this boundary arises? There can be a mind on one side of the boundary or a segment of a mind on one side of the boundary and another segment of a mind on the other side of the boundary. Now we have one observing the other from the outside, with that outside being determined by that boundary. That boundary is a dissociative boundary. So maybe we've never really been separated. Maybe that feeling of being completely isolated individuals is just part of the experience. We live as if we were a wave forgetting that it belongs to the ocean. And every now and then that illusion seems to fade away. There are people who discover it during deep meditation, a near-death experience, or a mystical state. For a moment, the separate self ceases to exist and only a deep sense of unity remains. And then an inevitable question arises. If everything comes from the same consciousness, what should we call that consciousness? And Kastrup, without hesitation, calls it God. That is omniscient, omnipresent, and omnipotent. And by the way, it's the only thing that exists, and it's you, and it's me, and it's the cat, and it's an amoeba, and it's the moons, and the black holes, and the stars, the whole set. So, divinity exists in his opinion, as we experience it. Can each of us experience it differently? But does it exist in his opinion? Of course, absolutely, we are it. Now that's not the idea of God that many of us grew up with. It doesn't talk about a serene being sitting somewhere in the universe, watching who does things right and who does things wrong. It speaks of something much deeper, of an infinite consciousness that expresses itself through all of existence. And if this were true, God wouldn't be somewhere. He would be here, right now, expressing himself through everything that exists and also through you. And maybe that's why when Neville Goddard talked about God, he didn't point to the sky but pointed to himself and also to you. Therefore, universal consciousness is all you need. It's all there is, and therefore it's omnipresent by definition. If it's all there is, then it's omnipresent, right? It's a mind, so it's omniscient. Omni means everywhere, and scient means to know. It's a mind, and whatever happens, happens within it. So it knows everything. It can be dissociated. What it knows through me is not accessible, but what it knows through you is accessible to you. You and I are that. And this is where things get even more interesting. Because if we really are all expressions of the same consciousness, then many experiences that we call paranormal today might not be so strange after all. That intuition that appears without explanation, thinking of someone right before they call you, or feeling that something happened to a loved one before you get the news. From a materialistic point of view, all of that is usually considered a coincidence or a misinterpretation of our memory. But from Kastrup's perspective, those experiences wouldn't be outside the model. They would be exactly the kind of phenomena that could occur if, deep down, we have never been completely separated. Telepathy can occur because dissociation, like any process in nature, is bound to be imperfect. We evolved to be dissociated, and we evolved to think that we are this bag of skin here and not what is happening out there. So, under analytic idealism, it is conceivable, even plausible, that under extraordinary circumstances, such as an emotional shock, you could have telepathy occurring between people who are very emotionally connected to each other. I've seen it happen to someone very close to me, and I have no doubt that it happens. I would go so far as to say that telepathy is common. We just don't recognize it, so we don't pay attention to it. So for Kastrup, these experiences are not miracles. They are small moments in which the illusion of being separate seems to break for a moment, as if for an instant we could glimpse a much deeper reality than we normally perceive. And if this completely changes the way we understand space, wait until you see what he proposes about time. Time and space exist only in here. We create time and space as a kind of filing system for information about the world. Even physics, with loop quantum gravity, is moving towards seeing time as something non-fundamental, as an emergent property of more fundamental structures in reality. So, for Bernardo Kastrup, time is not something that exists out there. It's the way consciousness organizes experience. That's why an hour can feel eternal when you're waiting for news, and it can fly by when you're enjoying something. And the clock shows the same time. But your experience of time changes. So, if everything we've seen today is true, the most fascinating idea is not that the physical world is an illusion, but that you have never been alone, nor isolated, nor disconnected. The universal mind is not in a distant heaven, but is the same consciousness that is observing, listening, and reasoning through you right now. And what's interesting is that Kastrup doesn't try to convince you that he's right, but instead invites you to look at reality from a completely different perspective. So the next time you look around, at your family, at the sky, or at a stranger on the street, remember this: you're not seeing others, you're seeing yourself from another perspective. And even if by the end of this video you don't agree with everything you heard, if for a second you questioned who you are, what consciousness is, and what the nature of reality is, then this video fulfilled its purpose.